All right, we are here. We are recording. I love to say recording live, but probably that should be a little bit of an oxymoron. So maybe I'm just going to try to limit myself to we are recording, but it is a joy to be here. Generous Theology with Chuck. Chuck, we are working through Reformed Dogmatics by Herman Bavinck, and we are in volume 1, the Prolegomena. Oh yes, he's holding up a copy, his copy. And the beautiful thing about Prolegomena is it sets up, it's like logistics. If an army is to go out in the field and conduct a successful campaign, they must execute on more than just the tactical aspects of engaging with the enemy and winning the battlefield. So they have to set up the supply chains, the supply routes, the logistics. They have to set up their personnel. They have to find all the right ways to support it. And that's what Prolegomena, the role that Prolegomena plays for theology. And we are coming in this section, this is pericope or paragraph 32 in chapter 2, the method and organization of dogmatic theology. We are coming to one of the most interesting historical situations, and that is how philosophy has impacted theology. And Chuck, I don't know if you have an intuitive sense that this was always bound to be this way, but it turns out that in history, theology and philosophy have a very strong connection. And maybe that's not intuitive to some people, and to others, it might be just an obvious given. So when you were first learning theology, when you were studying philosophy, when you're getting your feet wet in these things, did you think these subjects would be so intertwined and so connected?
Yeah, I think so. It depends a little bit. One of my friends often talks about that when you tell a story, you have to define the beginning of the story, and sometimes the story changes if you change the beginning of the story, right? And so I mostly think of formal study of theology and philosophy. And when I went to Christian schools, so we always had Bible class. When you're a little kid in elementary school, even in junior high school, a lot of what you're doing at that point is just biblical knowledge, right? So it depended on the school I was in, because I did change schools between when I moved from New Jersey to Iowa between 5th and 6th grade. But there was a Bible curriculum. Both of them from what became Christian Schools International at the time was National Union of Christian Schools, but two different curricula. And you learn these stories, and you learn the stories based on theme. But then I got to high school, and at my high school, freshman theology was interesting. Freshman theology class was a 1-semester class, but you took it depending on what freshman schedules looked like. You might take it either first and fourth quarter or second and third quarter. And most of the basketball players, for example, would take it first and fourth quarter because instead of PE, they were having freshman basketball practice during that period of the day. And I ended up in that section, even though I was not a basketball player, just because of the rest of my schedule. And that division was a little bit interesting, but it also meant that I jumped right in. First or second day of school, we were in freshman theology, and the teacher taught us the word hermeneutics. And you and I have talked about hermeneutics a number of times. And certainly it was appropriate to high school students the way we talked about it. But hermeneutics really is a philosophical discussion, right? And he taught it to us in a way that was very theology based. He talked about a redemptive historical method of interpretation and those kinds of things, and took us through other hermeneutical principles and why, and it was really more about why the Reformed redemptive historical method is the best method. That's the way he taught it. But you jump right in, right? In junior high, you spent all the time just walking through. That's what we did from 6th to 8th grade. We started at Genesis 1 and we ended at Revelation 22. And over 3 years, we went through all the scriptures. And now he's jumping in on hermeneutics and how do you interpret and those kinds of things. And it was exciting to me because for me, I always had a little bit of a philosophical bent. When you're a kid, that can mean different things than maybe when you're an adult. But I was always interested in those things. So jumping right into hermeneutics in my theology class, which in many ways was rather philosophical, made some sense. And then the curriculum in high school school varied depending on the year. We did a year of church history and we did some other things. And then I got into college. And in college, again, I went to a Christian college, Dordt University. And they do require at Dordt, still today, I believe, they do require a certain number of theology classes, and they do require a basic philosophy course as well. And it was interesting to me as well. I actually ended up taking my philosophy class. How did I take it? I took it, I think, as maybe a second semester freshman. I took it fairly early. I know that I took my philosophy class before my wife, then girlfriend, took hers, and she was a year ahead of me in school. I think she took hers maybe as a junior. And it was very interesting there, too, because my particular philosophy professor, and they gave some free rein to the different professors to have different syllabi and those kinds of things. The philosophy class in many ways was totally caught up in that reformed world and life view that was based very much on having your theology straight. And a lot of times, even as we were discussing philosophy, and we spent a lot of time talking about the theory of the cosmonomic idea by Herman Dooyeweerd, but a lot of times what you end up doing is going back to your theological basis as well. And then my theology class, my basic theology class with Reverend Wayne Kobus, who actually saw last week, which was cool. He was here in Wisconsin for a church meeting. Dr. Kobus, started with some things on Genesis and some of the structures of Genesis, but then he went on into a theology of the human and what is a human being, and looked at a lot of the theological pieces of it. But of course, you still get into philosophy there too, right? I still remember, as a result of that class, that theology class, a number of my friends who I still get together with, they were just on the group text yesterday wishing me a happy birthday and talking about a number of different things. And I remember with those guys sitting around in one of the lounges at the college in the evening after we had Dr. Kobus's theology class. And Dr. Kobus had presented that there were some different views among Christians about whether the body is made up of body, or a human is made up of body and soul, or body, soul, and spirit, and some other ideas. And I still remember having a rather lengthy discussion. We're talking about hours. We went into the wee hours of the morning with a couple of friends about just that. Are we made up of body and soul, or body, soul, and spirit? And if we're body, soul, and spirit, what's the difference between? Very philosophical discussions, but it came out of theology. So that's all. It's all to say that, yeah, I always recognized that there was a tie. But just recognizing that and having experienced it doesn't mean that it still doesn't come as like a, wow, the light bulb comes on again when we read Bavinck. Because Reformed Dogmatics, we expect this to be primarily a theological work. You and I have talked a little bit about, we've done some philosophy, and we were thinking about doing something a little more theological, and yet here we go. Right here in the Prolegomena, we're talking a lot about philosophy, right? And Bavinck is diving into it. And so again, it's maybe not something new for me, but it's a reminder of what I had remembered from all those years before, that these things really are tied together. And Abraham Kuyper is credited with the saying, all of life is religion. And to some extent, I think that's really true, right? Theology and religion aren't exactly the same thing, and you can quibble a little bit about what his quote means, but our being as religious beings, as humans who are in relationship with God, who live as creatures in a world that's been created by God, that has an impact on everything, right? It has an effect on our theology. It has an effect on our science. It has an effect on our psychology. It has an effect on our literature. It has an effect on everything. And so then it shouldn't really be all that surprising that philosophy, too, is tied very closely to our theology, to who we are as people who are created by God, creatures made in the image of God. All these theological concepts, they have to affect our philosophy. They have to affect the way that we do philosophy, and realistically, they do. And it does for everyone. A lot of people may not recognize their own religious presuppositions, but as Bavinck has said before, there really is no such thing as presuppositionlessness. right? That we all have presuppositions, even if we don't recognize them. And those presuppositions, in many ways, are religious in character, even if we don't want to admit that. Even if we say, "Oh, we're secular, we're not religious." No, that in and of itself is a religious worldview that impacts how you see the world. And yeah, I mean, in a way, it's, well, of course, Bavinck's going to spend a lot of time talking about philosophy because theology has a role in all of those things. And perhaps as we get into other areas of dogmatics, or if we, as you and I have done, we've read the first volume of Reformed Ethics, which gets into practice and those kinds of things. There, religion is going to have, theology is going to have an impact as well on very, very specific areas of study and areas of endeavor. So yeah, it's a good reminder of that.
Chuck, I love that breakdown. I think you've identified the key issues, and Bavinck goes into this. What are we trying to do when we examine theology versus philosophy? We're trying to gauge, in some sense, to what degree philosophy might advance theology, might be a servant of theology. There's this idea from the Middle Ages that philosophy is the handmaid of theology. And so the idea is that it's a separate but subordinate serving role that it plays in answering theology, which is thought of in the higher sense, much like a queen would have her chambermaid, her handmaid. And of course, in the later part of the Middle Ages and transitioning into the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, there was really an interesting, I don't know if you want to call it a palace coup, but certainly an interesting juxtaposition in the roles as philosophy went out on its own. And in many schools of thought, in many places, philosophy became the ultimate normative science and contra, or in opposition to, theology. And especially in the secular academy, in the Enlightenment, in the Renaissance, it was not the case that philosophy became the queen and then theology remained as a servant, as a handmaid, as a chambermaid. Rather, philosophy became the queen of the sciences and theology was just out in the streets. And so Bavinck gives us a really nice look at this history. And so we're looking at the history first before we even decide on what should be. So the first step is to measure what is in terms of history, what was. And so one of the main areas where philosophy came in was in this idea of prolegomena. And so when people started talking about theology, they started arguing what are the right questions. They started framing discussions. They started searching for a worldview. They started searching for proper language. They started writing dictionaries and lexicons. And they started to try to understand what were the guiding and defining questions. And so you see the tension in theology and in philosophy over these centuries. I'll give you some examples. So the first example is, what is the highest aim? What is the highest goal for humankind? And two competing schools of thought largely came out of these several hundreds of years. So you, on one side, you have this idea that the highest aim, the greatest end, is human flourishing. And so all things should fit under the goal of advancing humankind and their life on earth and the quality of their life on earth. And then you have, maybe in contrast to that, a competing worldview that the highest aim ought to relate to humankind's duty to God. So think here of Kant and his moral imperative, his categorical imperative. And so we have philosophers like Kant who thought that the ultimate aim was humankind served God, and everything we did was ordered and purposed around that. So which one is true? Sometimes people would come into an argument assuming one school was true, and then they would interact with people in the argument who were assuming another thing. And what would happen? Chuck, you and I know how easy it is for people to talk past each other. And so that happened a lot. I'll give you another example. So we have this idea of human-centered. So philosophy is ultimately human-centered and human-measured and evaluated versus having an extra human or an ontological grounding. So think of here of human-centered as being maybe something like the modern phenomenology movements. And in competition with them, you have these ideas, that what is right for humankind exists objectively outside of the human animal and is grounded in reality itself. Even in a Christian worldview, is grounded in the reality that God, the lawgiver, the divine lawgiver, has given. So which one is true? People from school A come into the conversation and interact with people from school B. And of course, you have people talking past each other. Sometimes they're using the same language, but they're meaning different things. So this is very confusing. And then finally, you have ultimately this humanism versus this objectivism. And so what are the answers? Where are we to go? Prolegomena helps that. Now, you and I are reading Bavinck. And so Bavinck is going to articulate a reformed dogmatics, a theology that makes human existence God-centered. And what is Bavinck's famous quote? We are to think God's thought after him. And so God is at the center. God and his ultimate purposes define and drive the ends to which we want to move towards. And in contrast with that, let's just say you have the phenomenology of various thinkers who would say things like, everybody has to serve somebody. You might as well serve yourself. And so the reference and the dominating, overriding concern is, how does it affect me? How does it affect individual humans? Or even how does it affect human flourishing? So Bavinck documents this. And so we have a fight, we have a tension in the late Middle Ages, transition to the Renaissance and Enlightenment period, between the scholastic modes of thinking on one hand that were probably dominating on the objectivist side, and then the humanist and phenomenological schools on the other hand. And so these two bumped into each other. And without prolegomena, it was sometimes very difficult to move things forward. So Bavinck documents that various thinkers present the prolegomena in various ways, and he talks it through the centuries. Now, Chuck, when you think about ideas that come up, and Bavinck here mentions ideas of, for example, rationalism, rationalistic foundations for dogmatics. And then you think about how he mentions Kant and Schleiermacher as maybe coming up against that. How do you think we ought to move and try to resolve these tensions? Or maybe the better answer is, what are the proper emphases for our inquiry? And how does Bavinck help us get there?
Yeah, one thing that I found super interesting in this particular section in Pericope 32, as Bavinck is describing the impact of philosophy, how he actually makes a tie between some of the medieval Roman Catholic philosophy and Aquinas. He doesn't specifically name Aquinas, but some of those scholastics that came from that time that we studied a while back, with this move towards rationalism and to an empiricism. He talks about how the influence of philosophy grew, and the starting point, the reformational position of the starting point of any sort of consideration of dogmatics being in faith was abandoned. And he says it was replaced by what he calls a return to that of Roman Catholic theology. The conviction took hold that human reason, even apart from faith, could of itself produce all the truths of natural theology. And I find that interesting that he makes that tie. We're not talking about that, well, here come the Middle Ages, and then it was like almost like this huge, the world blew up and everybody stopped thinking that way, and there was this whole brand new idea that just took over. But rather, he sees some level of continuity between the scholastics and this next way of thinking, where that was very rational. And then that leads then to further consideration by folks like Kant first, and then later people like Schleiermacher, who often, while on the one hand rebel against a pure sort of rationalism, because they as Kant talks about, that Kant recognizes that the only things you can deal with in that way are those that you can see and observe, and that there is a sort of a world beyond that. But that sort of then leads to that movement that you've described, that Kant, he doesn't necessarily begin it, but he is one of the people who really takes the next step with it of becoming human centered. And you move down the line, and even somebody like Schleiermacher, who, as we talked about yesterday, I have no doubt that Schleiermacher himself was a Christian in many ways. He believed himself to be a Christian. He believed himself to doing good work in theology, but under sort of the influence of all that came before him, he really took that turn towards the self as the primary way that we really come to know. We come to know God, we come to know ourselves theologically, is by diving into the self. And so there's that path. There's that pathway there that we can see. I also found there were a couple of other quotes in this section that I just found to be sort of interesting. Bavinck talks about, and maybe there's a little bit of irony here, but it's maybe good irony. Bavinck talks about how this movement to giving reason the prerogative of investigating the truth of revelation, natural theology, providing the solid ground on which to stand, a purely scientific foundation, revelation is examined in that way. And then he says, in this matter, the prolegomena to theology consistently grew in scope. Right? He says there's more and more prolegomena now because you got to explain all this other stuff before you get into questions about revelation and about scripture. And so he says religion as distinct from theology is discussed first, followed by natural theology, or the truths of nature and reason, and the possibility, necessity, and reality of revelation are demonstrated at length before scripture itself is considered. And scripture's truth is substantiated with an assortment of historical, critical, and rational proofs. Only after traveling this long road did theologians get to the actual content of dogmatics, which they then presented as plainly and simply as possible. Now, perhaps the irony here is that in a 4-volume set on dogmatics, the entire first volume is entitled Prolegomena, and that's Bavinck doing that, and in many ways maybe doing what he criticizes others for doing. But I think it's also a good irony, because I think what's happening here now, and what's so important about Bavinck's Prolegomena, is he's now speaking in a world where that alternative prolegomena, shall we say, has won the day, has taken over, and there is a need to get back to prolegomena that goes back to the old way of doing things, that puts scripture at the center, that makes faith at the core of what we're doing. But because that is no longer the natural, the way everybody thinks anymore, it actually takes more work in prolegomena to get there. So that was also an interesting thing where he points out that now there's all this long circuitous prolegomena that has to happen because of all this. And now I'm going to explain it to you why that's a problem in this entire volume of prolegomena. But it's all good. And then there is, I think, another section here where, and this really gets into things that we've talked about before, so it's not necessarily anything new, but it's Bavinck saying things that we've also pointed out ourselves as we've criticized others. And Bavinck says that in this rationalistic foundation of dogmatics, which has been undermined by Kant and then by Schleiermacher, it attempted to save faith and the doctrine of faith by restricting them to feeling and the description of feeling, respectively. But actually, this doesn't change anything, because you still have the issue of, well, how do you know? What do humans know, and what can they know? And he points out that even in this way of doing things, in Kant and Schleiermacher rebelling against a very strictly rationalistic foundation of dogmatics, the ability to know is still restricted to the visible world, and revelation is considered impossible. And I think we've seen that in Schleiermacher, right? That in many ways, revelation itself, as in the revelation of Scripture as being the Word of God revealed to us, that becomes almost impossible in Schleiermacher's way of doing things. And instead, it's really about our reaction to those words where we gain truth, and about our feelings and how we respond. It's the response that is meaningful rather than the revelation that's meaningful. And a while back, I was talking about different curricula I did in Bible, and my elementary school Bible curriculum was called Revelation and Response. And for us second and third and fourth graders, we didn't totally understand what was going on there. But that title was really about making sure that, yeah, response is important, right? We want children who are learning Scripture to respond to it in particular ways. But what has to come first is that revelation. And so here's Bavinck again making that point that you and I have talked about quite a bit, but he makes it very clearly, very succinctly, in just a single sentence that, like, in the middle of that page, I've just got highlighted like 18 times because it's such a core of what he's saying in this section. So yeah, this is good stuff. Was there anything more in this historical piece that you feel like we haven't picked up on yet that you want to make sure that we don't lose the thread on?
Yeah, thank you for that, Chuck. There is one thing that I wish to say, and one of the reasons why Bavinck is pure gold is because of the references. So not only does he outline the history of the tension in the successive generations between theology and philosophy, between a certain kind of prolegomena A, versus another kind of prolegomena B. Not only does Bavinck do that, but here's the big thing. He sprinkles in enough examples of different theologians who are examples of these different tensions. So he'll say, this set of theologians emphasized rationalistic thought. This set of theologians emphasized the human condition. This set of theologians emphasized the importance of a Trinitarian organization of the content. This set of theologians emphasized building an entire dogmatics before coming to a dogmatic, while this set of theologians got straight into the dogmatics without a big prolegomena section. And because he's put all of these names here, we're actually able to go back and look up all of these theologians' works. One of the things that's huge, this cannot be overstated, Chuck. You and I have talked about this before. One of the things that cannot be overstated is what a golden age we live in today. Because in Bavinck's age, having this list of theologians organized like this, pure gold. And if you were a high-level theologian on the continent in Bavinck's day, maybe you had this list and everybody else was out in the cold. And now, because of the advances in technology and the scholarly research that has made more materials available, a student could go through Bavinck's categorization and flesh out and could go and see all of the dogmatics from, what is it, a dozen and a half theologians that are mentioned in this section. It's a stupendous list. And had Bavinck not written this list, how could we have reconstructed it ourselves? But because he has written these lists and organized these lists, we now are in a position to go back and see all of the works from these theologians as they come available, and to go back and check Professor Bavinck's understanding. Not in the sense that we're trying to check him the way a teacher would check a student, but just to go back and get a sense of the flavor. And so, Chuck, I don't know. I've been working with dogmatics for 20 years, and I don't know another theologian who's given so much organizing material, complete with references to other theologians to follow up on. Just following this section, Chuck, we could establish a graduate program at any school of theology in the country and give those graduate students enough work just working with this section of material. And I can't overstate how important that is. I don't know of another theologian in 200 years who has given us material with this breadth. Having said that, I'm going to just throw out, I see this kind of information, for example, with Richard Muller, Reformed dogmatician, classical theist. Muller is an example to me of somebody who writes in this same style. He says, he lists the sources, he lists the names, he lists the organizing concepts. And what a blessing Bavinck and Professor Muller have been. So I just wanted to emphasize that. My jaw drops at this. And so that was very valuable. And what does this mean, this impact of philosophy? And how would we summarize this pericope? And I'm going to throw it back to you, Chuck, for the final word. But I think Bavinck would very likely leave the answer open. He would probably say, look at these lists of all of these theologians who used all of these themes, and why limit somebody to just one approach when you have all of these different schools of thought. Chuck, how do you feel about that? Do you agree, disagree? What would you try to do if you wanted to go through and really accurately catalog all of these different schools of thought that Bavinck's brought up?
Yeah, as you point out, the material here, not just in the material itself, but even in the references, is amazing. And I was just looking at, as you were making that comment, my book was open to the last paragraph of Pericope 33, and just in that paragraph itself, he must list 35, 40 different theologians who have different decisions on that they've made about the ordering of dogmatics. He talks about some who Vilmar and Boll and Hodge and Shedd, who continue the usual order with theology and anthropology and Christology. Others that he names, Canis and Eberhard and Schweitzer and others, the Trinitarian division. Others take on a particular attribute of God, and he names some, or life, and he names a couple. Those who view the salvation presented by the Christian religion more objectively proceed from Christology, and so he lists a number of those. And then others that make the contrast between sin and grace. And he just keeps on going. It's amazing what he's got there. And I would agree with you that in the end, Bavinck doesn't come to a conclusion that there is one right way. Obviously, Bavinck himself has chosen a particular way after going through Prolegomena. He makes certain decisions about where to go and the sort of the order that he takes once he gets into the next section. And he starts, for example, we're just about done with the section on the introduction to dogmatics. Now he's going to talk about history and literature of dogmatic theology, some of the foundations, Principia, and then he talks about revelation and faith in the rest of this particular section. So that's a choice. But I agree with you that he doesn't necessarily say that particular choice must at all times be normative, right? And I think we talked a little bit about this last week, that there may be some reasons why a particular writer might choose a different order. Some of those reasons might be related to what's going on in the culture at the time, right? If there may be certain issues that are just at the center of what needs to be talked about and the center of the mission of the church. Well, if you've got one of those really, really key issues, you're probably going to make a big deal out of that. And that's going to determine your prolegomena. It's going to determine your order in some ways. And at another time, there may be another issue, right? And at the time of the Reformation, salvation, soteriology, was really a key part of that. But there may be other times where something else needs to be the key. Not that we forget about soteriology, because that's certainly important, but there may be other things. Another way might be an author, a writer, who's doing dogmatics, but is wanting to take a particular focus. And this is somewhat like the issue with what's going on in the culture at the time, but maybe a little bit different yet. Maybe there's just a particular issue that you'd like to frame, and you're not trying to replace the large overarching dogmatics by people like Calvin and Bavinck, but rather you're trying to dive a little more deeply into some very specific issues. Well, that's going to affect how you do the prolegomena. I think I mentioned last week Gordon Spikeman's Systematic Theology, which is one that I appreciate. It's a single volume. It's not meant to be entirely comprehensive in scope, but it was designed to get at some very particular issues and has been useful for me in doing some of the work that I do there as well. And then there may also be sometimes you're doing dogmatics as a contrast to or as a response to particular writers. It might be particular worldviews, it might be fellow Christians, it might be non-Christians. But again, where you're doing a kind of dogmatics that's really meant to be more responsive, or perhaps it's meant to be more apologetic, that might also determine how the order that you take and what's in your prolegomena and how long you go with that. And I think Bavinck would be okay with that. I think he would find that to be entirely appropriate given the circumstance. I don't think he'd be sitting back with a frown on his face saying, well, I don't think that's the right, I don't really get that impression from what he writes here. How about you? It sounds like you're headed in that same as well. Is that kind of what you're thinking?
Let me tell a story, a true story. when I first started the study of theology, this was roughly 20 years ago. And when I got into building a theological library, my initial impulse was to just get the one. I just wanted the right one. Give me the right systematic theology. I saw that there were a multiplicity of different systematic theologies and dogmatics out there. And I remember praying, thinking to myself, asking the Lord, I just want to get the right one. And I only want to get the one that is going to put it in the right order, organize the content in the right way, the way that it's supposed to be. And my pastor, who is a mentor for me in this process, and by the way, not just this pastor, but he was a great example of it. I've noticed my whole life that pastors have these large libraries, and it was rare for me to see a pastor who did not have a library with thousands of volumes in it. And I remember I'm starting down that path, and I remember thinking to myself, I don't want to be like that. I just want one little shelf on one bookcase, just 3 or 4 volumes of theology total for all of theology. And I just wanted the one right way. Well, Chuck, you can already guess the joke has been on me. My bookshelves now look like the libraries of those pastors. And the idea of converging around one particular way of organizing, one right way, one ring of theology to rule them all, so to speak, has fallen by the wayside. And I now see there is great blessing in having manifold, multiple kinds of organization for this content. And it fits with this idea that of the manifold wisdom of God. Why should we think that there can only be one proper order? Why should I think that when it comes to listing God's attributes, that there must be only one list and there must be the same number of items in every list? I've done a little study of that, looked at various systematic theologies, and I've noticed, why don't they agree on the listing of the attributes of God? And I've always thought that could be used by critics as a criticism of Christianity. Oh, your Christianity is so diverse. You systematicians can't even agree on what your list of attributes for your God is. And I thought maybe that was a negative. But now, in light of Bavinck's chapter here, I see that it could really be no other way. And so in that sense, that represents development. That represents movement, hopefully improvement in the situation. And so will my library include all of the dogmaticians that Bavinck has mentioned in this section? Wow, that would be a challenge. And to then be relatively facile in all of them would be even more of a challenge still. I think that if there was a young graduate student who wanted to invest the next 40, 50 years of his life, this would be a great topic. And so I'm grateful that Bavinck did not allow that conclusion to come out. And I want to push back. Richard Muller does this as well. And Bavinck mentions in this section, he says there are some theologians who insist on organizing theology around one central theme, one overriding theme. In some cases, it's justification. In other cases, it's the Holy Trinity. In other cases, it's this synthetic genetic method. And I think we have to understand that theologians who only want there to be one right way of organizing this content have a defect or have a not mature, non-facile understanding. And so, Chuck, them's fighting words in theology circles, I know, but I can't see it any other way. What's your thinking on that? Is that a fair conclusion to come to?
I think it is. Even sort of at the end of this chapter, one of the things that Bavinck points out is that in the end, dogmatics is about the knowledge of God as he's revealed it in Christ through his word. And he says the knowledge of believers is unique in that they view the whole of life religiously, theologically, and see everything in God's light from the perspective of eternity. That is the difference between their worldview and a philosophical or scientific worldview. In dogmatics, it's always believers, Christians, who are speaking. They don't speculate. They don't proceed from an abstract philosophical concept. Now, I think there's a flip side to that, which is then that if dogmatics really is the content of dogmatics is the knowledge of God, and it's as it's revealed to us, there is, as much as we will always say that it's not about us, right? It's not about our reactions that determine what truth is. It's not about our feelings. It's not about our engagement. It is only about revelation. There still is a sense in which we have to receive that content in particular ways based on who we are. And as we are unique people created by God in his image, but also created as unique persons. And so there's always going to be some variety of experience. There's going to be some variety of how we understand things. That doesn't mean that everybody's right, that you have your truth, and it's all good. But it does mean that there's always going to be some variety in how we need to hear these truths. And I think Bavinck recognizes that. And there's a quote here, which I don't know that it was entirely meant for this particular context, but it's right here in this section. And I think it's meaningful. Bavinck says, "In every dogma, therefore, throbs the heartbeat of religion." And if you've got a dogma that has a heartbeat, and it's that heartbeat of religion, that makes it in some ways a living thing. Now, by living, again, I don't want to get into sort of this idea that, oh, it's living, it could mean just about anything, it can change here, it can evolve there. No, that's not what it means. But it does mean that that dogma, as we understand it, is our relation, how we relate to Scripture, how we relate to revelation, and it has to do with our understanding. So again, how we do dogmatics may have some variety depending on the circumstances, and I think that's something that Bavinck is willing to hold on to. And even as I say a lot of this, I find myself saying, okay, I don't want to go too far. I don't want to go down the road of, oh, everything's relative. And so I understand why those who think this is fighting words, that there has to be a single way of organizing this material, a single way of doing dogmatics. I understand where they're coming from, right? They're not coming out of they're just wrong-headed people who are really stubborn and only want things to be one way. That's not it at all. What it is they have very real concerns about what happens when you go too far the other way. And what I appreciate is that Bavinck still anchors himself in revelation. He anchors himself in Scripture. He anchors himself in God revealing himself as he is, and to humans, to his creatures. He anchors himself in that, but he still allows for our response as humans to still have some impact there in how we then come to understand those dogmas. It doesn't change the material, it doesn't change the truth, but it allows us to hear things in ways that make the best sense for us who we are. So that's something I really appreciate about Bavinck.
So we are in a situation where we can value the efforts. And by the way, this is counterintuitive, Chuck, like you say. It was certainly contrary to my original evaluation and understanding. I just wanted to learn theology the right way. Well, the joke is on me. And like you said, there is a pull for there to be one right way for people to learn dogmatics. But the pull usually comes from theologians who have a specific audience in mind. And what a people-oriented business the task of theology turns out to be. And Chuck, when I was young, I was in the elevator in university, and I was one of those shy, emo, introverted geeks, and I was very soft-spoken. I wanted to just slink off into a corner and tap on a computer keyboard and interact with the computer screen. I didn't want to interact with people. And so I was in school to learn this new science called computer science. And I remember I was going in an elevator from floor to floor, and I would shrink away from people as they would come into the elevator because I just wanted to be alone, and I had an introverted sense to myself. And I remember thinking, Lord, I want to do computer science because then that way I won't have to interact with people or deal with people at all. And I see you smiling and I see you giggling because, of course, the Lord had the last laugh on me, because at the end of the day, being in computer science is all about dealing with people. And it's the exact same way with theology. Some people have this idea of, I don't want to deal with the mess of humanity and the human condition and all the complications that just makes an introvert's brain hurt. But if you come to theology on that basis and you start to study, I think you're going to find that theology is all about people, even as it is simultaneously all about God. And what a journey to go on, Chuck. That would not have been what my own naive understanding would have intuitively thought how it was going to work out. And so the things I talk about today, Chuck, I didn't anticipate talking about them 10, 15 years ago. And now we're talking about them, and it is amazing. So there's maybe one other aspect to this that I want to bring up and then catch your response to maybe close this discussion session. One, and that this concerns the importance of reading, of being facile in theology text. Now, it's not a requirement, Chuck, to be a believer that one must know the systematic theologies from 35 theologians. You pointed out that Bavinck listed all of those. And could you imagine, Chuck, if that was the entrance requirements at heaven? We talk jokingly about St. Peter at the gate, and he says, what is the difference between the systematic theology of Paulinus and Van Maastricht in comparison with Shedd and Dabney? And whoa, Chuck, who's going to get into heaven if that's the entrance criteria? So I don't want anybody to think that God has done that, because God has made it so absolutely easy. It is the easiest thing in the world for people to be saved. Having said that, what are we going to do with all of the varied aspects of theology that are presented to us? And that's the big surprise. That's where I never saw it going. I think I was with those other theologians who thought there has to be the one right way of organizing. And now that I don't, I despair that theology might ever converge. Now, let me say that in a careful way, because I'm not saying that we don't already have a good convergence in theology now. Bavinck gives us the topics and the emphases. As a matter of fact, name another science that has maintained the list of topics and emphases to the same degree that theology has. Look at chemistry today versus chemistry 800 years ago. Completely different. Look at physics today versus physics 2,000 years ago. Not even close. And yet, within reason, theologians can pick up texts from 500, 1,000, 1,500, 2,000 years ago and still be conversant. And what I wanted to say is that, Chuck, I want to encourage people to be readers in theology, aggressive readers, because just as a musician learns his craft not by performing the standard repertoire. Don't get me wrong, the standard repertoire is important, but what is the bread and butter of his facility? It's in playing scales. So when I was in university, I had to walk past the music school at my university, and there were students in the music programs who were in the practice rooms at the Music School of Art all day. And those practice rooms were booked almost 24/7. You could be walking past the music school at 1 a.m. or 12 noon, and you would hear 10 different students in practice rooms performing their scales. Do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. And then they would go backwards. Do, ti, la, so, fa, mi, re, do. And then they would go forwards again. And then they would try all the permutations. And in theology, facility comes with reading. And reading comes with volume. And I hate to make a statement like that, but if someone wants to be in theology but does not have a hunger for reading large volumes, I'm not trying to say you're out of the kingdom. I'm not trying to say you can't read theology. But I think what needs to happen is, unless you have this multidimensional approach, it's very difficult to wrap your arms around the tree trunk of theology, because it's a big tree. And I want to say that not to discourage people, but to maybe just try to say, hey, count the cost. If you want to be skilled in theology, you need to be willing to make this kind of investment. And Chuck, that might not be a popular message, but How does it strike you? We're thinking about the next generation. We're hoping people listen to this and maybe decide and say to themselves, wow, I want to study Bavinck. And here I am saying, unless you're ready to read thousands of pages of theology every year, you're not going to be any good. Not that that's exactly what I'm saying, but I just want to emphasize that that's so much of what's involved is in that volume and in that repeated doing of the work. And Chuck, I don't know if we're talking more people out of it or if we're talking more people into it by trying to mention that. What do you think about that idea? And if so, would you phrase it a different way, or would you try to encourage people that it's still worth it even if you have to do those kinds of things? Are we being a help here to the next generation?
Well, how I would put it is, I have three responses, and they all go together. It's not like they're mutually exclusive here. One response would be different people are called to different things, right? There's the texts in Paul's text that talk about how we're all one body, but as a body we have different parts, and each part has a different function. And so there are people to whom they are called to do more in the way of theology than others. So that's one piece of it. I would say that not every single person is called to read tens of thousands of pages of theology. But the flip side to that, and something that I think we do have to focus on, is that there still is a role for all Christians in theology to be aware. And it's going to be different for different people. People have different skill levels. People have different amounts of time to be able to put to it. But I was recently talking to a couple of friends of mine, and we were talking about how, for example, the church library at my church, a number of years ago, the leadership at the time, most of whom aren't there anymore, decided they wanted to get rid of the library. And I don't understand quite why they wanted to get rid of the library, but they did. They felt that people weren't using it, so maybe let's get rid of it. Well, what we ended up doing is the church opened it up, said anybody wants to grab any resources out of the library, go ahead. And so I went and grabbed a few things, and then the next week I grabbed a few more. And then when it came to the deadline and 98% of the library was still there, I took 98 of the library and took it home, and it's now in my basement. and I tell people at my church now, I said, look, this is good stuff. Yeah, most of it's a little older. They hadn't updated it, but there's a lot of really good stuff there, and it's there. And anybody who wants to use it, it's still there. As far as I'm concerned, it's the church library sitting in Chuck's basement is all of it, and anybody can use it. And one of the in talking about that happening, we mentioned that there was a time when your average church member was much more literate. And in fact, I was looking through with some folks, some of the books that were in the church library. And we're talking about books, this would have been, by now 75, 80 years ago. And at that time, the members of my particular congregation, as the church started, they began in the 1950s. They broke off from a parent congregation, another of the same denomination in that town, which has been around for probably 150 years. But you look at these books, and a lot of them were donated by members of the church who had bought them themselves to read, highlighted them, and then put them in the church library. And the people who read these books, these were folks who worked in the brass factory at Kohler, or they worked in the ceramics at American Orthodontic, or they were farmers. And yet they were reading this relatively heady theology and the important issues of the day. And we've maybe lost some of it. We've lost some of the idea that the kleine Leuten, that's a term we've used quite a bit. Abraham Kuyper often referred to the little people, the kleine Leuten, as being really the heart and soul of the church, meaning just the regular old people, not the people who, are going off to universities and getting 7 degrees, that kind of thing, but just the regular people. We've lost the idea that they also need to be very theologically conversant. And it's going to be in different ways. You don't expect the grandma who spends most of her days taking care of the kids or baking pies to maybe have the same conversant as her pastor and in a particular area of theology. You don't expect a fellow who, at the end of a 12-hour shift working in the brass foundry at the Kohler Company and is tired to be able to spend the same amount of energy as a theologian at the seminary on a particular issue, but yet it's still important to be there. And then the third thing that I would say, so we talk about the importance of everyone being involved, even though there is a difference in how people will be involved because we are one body but many parts. But the last thing I would say is that this also gets to the importance of supporting our pastors. And our pastors, we hope that they have large bookshelves and libraries. And part of the way that we can help them do that is by giving them the opportunity to do that, helping them out with making sure they have the materials they need, helping them out with making sure that they have the time to do the study that's necessary. Because in many ways, what pastors are doing with their weekly sermons is taking all of that, they're doing theology, right? And then they're presenting it in a sermon by presenting God's word to us, the listeners, in a way that is going to be meaningful and helpful to us, right? They're considering the audience. They're, in some ways, they're the ones who are filtering all of this data that's out there, much of which is beyond most of us, but then focusing it in a way that is meaningful. And what an important job that is. And unfortunately, I think sometimes we don't value our pastors enough, and we expect them to do all sorts of other things that isn't that, right? We want them, oh, you should be showing up at all these 47 events because we just need to have you be the face of the church there. Nice, if he's got time. Is it going to take away from the study of theology and the study of the word and the application of that to the lives of their congregation? And I noticed that a local pastor in my area, in our denomination, he was just given a 3 or 4 month sabbatical. And another friend of mine as well, who is a pastor in Minnesota, he's actually on his second sabbatical at the church that he's at, about a 4-month sabbatical. And I went to my church council and I said, I don't know whether our pastor wants that right now, but even if he doesn't, we ought to be talking about it regularly. We ought to be offering it as a possibility so that he can do the work that he needs to do and do it better. If he's spending all his time doing other stuff and he can't take the time to really focus and do that reading that's necessary, he's not going to be able to do his job as well. And so we need to be in regular contact with him. And as an elder at our elders meeting, that's one of the things that we do. We every month we ask him, so how you doing? What are you reading? What do you need from us to be able to do this job well? And I fear that sometimes we don't do that, and we expect so much else out of our pastors. We've gotten into this corporate model of pastor as CEO, and I'm just not a big fan of that. And part of that is because it takes away from us. So I'm glad that we've talked about it, because it's very practical, as well as you and I and others who are listening, as we're members of various local congregations. Hopefully, even just thinking about how we can care for our pastors is something that we can get out of what we've read from Bavinck.
Chuck, what a way to wrap up a great discussion. Thank you, my friend. I loved the considered nature of that, because there's a pastor's heart in there. I was talking with some friends earlier today, and we were talking about the wealth of the scriptures. And sometimes in the culture, there is this jaded narrative frame that Christians are just trying to sell their religion to people. And you can paint that painting if you want to. But with what you just said, Chuck, I'm reminded of the fact that if you and I are quote unquote Christian salesmen, we are only getting paid when we get to heaven in that ultimate sense. And we are perhaps the only salespeople who become wealthier the more we give that wealth away. And so I was saying in another segment earlier today with some other friends, my riches, my Christian commission, my payment is not going to be selling somebody something and counting the money that I get to put in my pocket. My payment is going to be in heaven, looking over at the brother who purchased the volume I was quote unquote selling, and having a discussion with them, between me and them in heaven. That's it. Chuck, we don't have some sinister scheme happening here whereby we are secretly profiting immense amounts of dollars, gold ounces, or any other forms of money. Where we will profit will be in heaven, when we are with all the people who we got to share these riches with. And they then took those riches and became wealthy themselves. And I'm amazed at God's economy, God's economic ideas of progress. And so look at us, Chuck. Here we are 100 years after Pastor Bavinck's death, sitting here talking about essays that he wrote 130 years ago, perhaps. And we are still being edified and being made wealthy by what he wrote 130 years ago. That's staggering for me to think about. And I want to thank you, Chuck, for the journey and for the discussion here. I think we've got something to be thankful for.